Right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Sebastian Payne. I'll be chairing this second session on Scotland and the future of the Union after Brexit. You have the biographies of our distinguished, eminent, and intellectually active speakers, so I won't go through that. You can see their impressive backgrounds for yourself. The running order is that Professor Nicola McEwen will speak first, followed by Professor Aileen McHarg. We then turn to John Curtice as the third speaker, who will be speaking remotely, and then we conclude with Reuben Duffy on my right. The speakers will speak for a maximum of 15 minutes, and there is just time for some short focus. All the questions before were short and focused, but if people stick to that laudable approach, we'll have time for a quick round of questions first. So to our first speaker, Professor Nicola McEwen.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that Brexit has presented for Scottish devolution and for the Scottish Parliament, partly as a precursor to some of the other presentations, perhaps to explain a little bit about why we are so quickly, following a previous referendum in 2014, returning to the issue of a Scottish independence, potential Scottish independence referendum again. Next slide, please. Anyone controlling the slides? Yep, great. Before I get into the particularities of Brexit and its effects, I think it's important to take a step back and think of how we conceptualise the United Kingdom as a state, perhaps rather different from how we think of France as a state, and at least from the perspective of Scotland and Wales and perhaps Northern Ireland too, although as we've just heard that's rather more complex. The UK is very much a union state. Sean this morning set out quite clearly the historical evolution of that. But that idea of the UK as a union state as opposed to a unitary state long predates the development of devolution. The distinctiveness of Scotland as a nation within the United Kingdom was one of the things that was secured through union, that flourished within union and flourished even before the political institutions were decentralised. Next slide, please. And when the Scottish Parliament was established, it was both a reflection of that status as a nation within the United Kingdom, an affirmation of it, and also a way to reinforce it. And we have seen a strengthening of Scotland's status as a distinctive political community since devolution and since the founding of the Scottish Parliament. And I say these things maybe seem obvious, but I think they partly explain why Brexit has created the difficulties that it has created within Scotland and considerations of Scotland's constitutional future. Next slide, please. The first of those challenges is going back to the vote itself. Given what I've just been saying, it was always going to be difficult to have a situation where you have a UK-wide unitary conception-based referendum based on a binary choice and a simple plurality within a multinational state. So you have the situation where, from the perspective of Scotland, Scotland's voice as a nation, as a political community within the United Kingdom, could not so much be heard, I think it was heard, but could not have a significance and a bearing on the outcome of one of the most major constitutional decisions that the United Kingdom has taken in recent years. The map on the left is somewhat of an exaggeration of the pattern of the vote in the Brexit referendum. It's taking the aggregate counts by local authority area, but it makes it look starker than it was in reality. But as you know, 62% in Scotland voted for the United Kingdom to remain within the European Union, so a healthy majority. But that didn't matter to the decision itself. Next slide, please. The second challenge that led to was that the Scottish Government, along with the Welsh Government, for the most part, there was no administration functioning in Northern Ireland, but they tried to influence the process of Brexit, to shape Brexit negotiations. And it had long been recognised within the context of devolution that although foreign policy and external relations, including relations with the European Union, are matters reserved to the UK Parliament, there was, from the outset of devolution, a memorandum of understanding that recognised that the devolved governments had a legitimate interest in shaping the UK's EU policy making, because so much of that impinged upon areas of devolved responsibility. And indeed, during the devolution years prior to Brexit, it was the one area of intergovernmental relations that functioned reasonably well. There was a joint ministerial committee on Europe that helped to shape the UK's EU policy making. So the devolved governments had a path into the development of the UK's EU policy. But that didn't happen in the context of Brexit negotiations. It looked like it might at the very beginning of the process when Theresa May first became Prime Minister. She set up new institutions along with the First Ministers, with the purpose and the remit of trying to find a common approach, setting expectations that the devolved governments would be able to influence that process. But having set those expectations rather high compared to previous forums for intergovernmental discussion, they singularly failed to meet those expectations, and the devolved governments were left frustrated at being outside of any sphere of influence over the direction of travel in Brexit negotiations. Next slide, please. The third challenge is perhaps a more practical one, although it does impinge on political authority, and that's what to do about Brexit and its impact on devolution and the system of multi-level government within the United Kingdom. Devolution was introduced within the context of EU membership, and that mattered more with hindsight than perhaps we realised at the time, in that the European Union provided a legal fabric, a framework within which devolution was developed. It meant that the devolved institutions, along with the UK Parliament, were legislating within the parameters of EU law, and that limited the extent to which they would diverge from each other. Didn't eliminate divergence altogether, it still permitted divergence, but within the framework of everyone being in line with and complying with EU law. Remove that external fabric, and what do you do to prevent each administration going off in very different directions in ways that could potentially be problematic for businesses, for citizens in the day-to-day. And all of the governments recognised this. They all recognised that this was a genuine challenge of Brexit, and they were all committed to doing what they had to do to perhaps potentially replace some of these EU regulatory frameworks with UK frameworks. And to their credit, the administration spent years working together to come up with some common frameworks. Perhaps where we got to is not quite where they thought they would be at the beginning of the process. There isn't, apart from in a very few areas of law, there aren't codified frameworks to replace EU frameworks in the UK, but rather they have reached agreement on common approaches, on communicating, on sharing information, on sharing, in some cases, standards, and on quite technical areas of law that had previously been under the competence of the European Union. Next slide, please. So the previous point around common frameworks, the important thing to note here is that that was very much a cooperative process. It was the governments working together, coming to the co-owning a process, co-deciding, co-determining the outcome. At the same time, the UK government embarked upon a parallel process that was much more unilateral to essentially achieve similar ends, but with a stronger legal underpinning. And the problem that they were trying to resolve is what you do to prevent barriers to trade and mobility once the United Kingdom left not just the European Union, but the EU internal market. The United Kingdom's approach, or the United Kingdom government's approach, was to establish a legal underpinning for the UK's domestic market. And it did so in the face of really very intense opposition from the devolved governments who were concerned at the impact that this would have on their political autonomy and the reach of their own lawmaking powers. And this was quite openly acknowledged in the government documents that accompanied the legislations. You can see here in the blue text, where the documents acknowledged that whilst the legislation would achieve the ambition of strengthening the domestic market and ensuring there wouldn't be mobility issues for businesses, that it could have the impact of making it more difficult for governments to achieve their societal goals, whether it's around environmental goals or public health goals, where these would impinge upon the market. That legislation was passed without the consent of the devolved institutions, not for the first time, but it was the first time that it had happened in legislation that was specifically targeted at reshaping the system of devolution. Next slide, please. And that brings me to the fifth and final challenge that I will talk about anyway. I'm sure there are others that will come up in the next presentations. But that's the challenge of what all of this means for the Sewell Convention. Now, you may be familiar with the Sewell Convention. The Sewell Convention was essentially a device or an approach that helped to marry political devolution within a constitutional framework that retained the sovereignty of the UK Parliament. All of the devolution settlements acknowledged that they did not undermine or change in any way the Westminster parliamentary sovereignty. The Westminster Parliament retains the authority to legislate on devolved matters, but by convention, they would operate a self-denying ordinance and generally or normally not do so. And in the context of Brexit, that convention, which I would argue has been quite symbolically significant in underpinning devolution within the United Kingdom, really quite important to the identity of those institutions as self-governing institutions, has been undermined in the context of Brexit. Now, the quote here from Kieran Martin, who is a former Constitution Director within the UK government, suggests that during the course of Brexit, there has been a de facto collapse of the Sewell Convention. I wouldn't go that far, but I think it's definitely, its significance has been somewhat eroded by the extent to which it has been set aside when consent is withheld, and also by, and Aileen will know more about this than I do, and she's written very eloquently on it, by the fact that it was tested for its legal weight and found wanting. So that in itself undermines the symbolic significance of the Sewell Convention and potentially of devolution as a result. And all of that, you won't be surprised to know, has led to a significant deterioration of the relationship between the UK government and the devolved governments, particularly the Scottish government, but not just the Scottish government. I think that's quite important as well. Next slide, please. Can this be fixed within the context of the current constitutional framework? Possibly. There are some signs of efforts to try to address some of these problems. There is a new intergovernmental machinery which has, after years of review, it's finally starting to be introduced. There is recognition on the part of at least some areas of the UK government that there are problems, particularly around Sewell. These things are on the agenda, and the new machinery should give the devolved governments a little bit more influence and potential to influence those discussions. But machinery will only take you so far. Political culture and commitment is much more important to whether or not these things are resolved. And personally, I think it's quite difficult to see the sorts of tensions that we've seen being resolved unless and until the issue of Scotland's constitutional future within the United Kingdom is once again addressed. And that's a neat segue to Aileen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McEwen. Our next speaker, Professor Aileen McHarg.
Just waiting for my slides, but thank you also from me for the invitation. It really is a very, very great pleasure to be in Paris in May. Very much nicer than Scotland in May. Okay, so as we wait for my slides, what I'm going to be talking about is to pick up on what Nicola said about the fact that one of the key impacts of Brexit in Scotland has been to ignite the campaign for a second independence referendum, even though Scottish voters had rejected independence by 55 to 45% less than 2 years before the Brexit referendum in September 2014. We're now almost 6 years on from the Brexit referendum, and what I want to suggest today is that campaign for a second referendum, although it hasn't gone away by any means, it does seem to have become rather stuck. In other words, there has been no very significant progress. There's been some, but no significant progress towards actually organising a referendum. So I want to try to explain why that process has become stuck by briefly outlining the legal position governing the Scottish independence process. Next slide, please. And my focus is going to be on the position in domestic constitutional law. I'm not going to say anything about international law. The reason for that is because the Scottish Government is acutely aware that there would be serious legitimacy risks, both domestic and international, if it were to try to secure independence through some extra constitutional process, through a process that was not regarded as valid within the UK constitutional order. So internally, there would be a strong risk of boycott from unionists, possibly even disruption, as we saw 100 years ago in relation to the secession of Ireland. Internationally, very highly unlikely that a unilateral declaration of independence would be acknowledged, and it would almost certainly destroy any chance of an independent Scotland rejoining the European Union. Next slide, please. So for Scotland, the legal position at one level is really very straightforward. in that, as with most other constitutional orders, the UK Constitution is legally silent on the question of whether Scotland can secede. In other words, it doesn't recognise a legal right to secede, nor does it explicitly regulate the process by which Scotland would become independent. And of course, that contrasts very starkly with the position in relation to Northern Ireland, as we heard from Katie. But the fact that there's no positive legal recognition of a right to become independent doesn't mean that it's constitutionally prohibited. On the contrary, because the fundamental principle of the UK Constitution is parliamentary sovereignty, Westminster Parliament can do whatever it likes, that means that it can also freely redraw the boundaries of the state. So fundamentally, the question of whether Scotland can become independent, and if so, on what terms it does so, is just a question of persuading the UK Parliament to legislate for independence. So in other words, it's fundamentally a political question rather than one which is constrained by legal rules. But where the law does become important is that it does clearly reserve the grant of independence to the UK Parliament. So under the Scotland Act 1998, which governs the devolution settlement in Scotland, the union of the kingdoms of Scotland and England is clearly a reserved matter, a matter reserved to Westminster. And that raises issues that I'll come back to in a minute about what lawfully the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament can do to advance their desire for independence. Next slide, please. So, as I said, this is primarily a political rather than a legal process. And there is, of course, an important political precedent, which is the 2014 independence referendum. So I want to just briefly look at what happened on that occasion. 2014 referendum was triggered by the fact that the SNP unexpectedly won a majority in the 2011 Scottish Parliament election on an explicit manifesto promise to hold a referendum. And the UK government immediately accepted that the SNP did have a mandate. And why did it do so? Well, to quote Kieran Martin again, he says, well, it was simply inconceivable to UK ministers that they could have ignored that mandate because it had long been accepted that Scotland's place in the Union was voluntary, and so it could become independent if that's what a majority of the Scottish people wanted to do so. So no legal right to self-determination for Scotland, but strong political acceptance that there was a right to self-determination. The UK government, though, in 2011 disputed whether the Scottish Parliament had the legal competence to legislate for a referendum, given the reservation of the Union to Westminster. So they thought that the reservation of the Union encompassed a referendum on independence. That was, though, a matter of some considerable legal dispute, going right back to discussions on the Scotland Bill itself. But it was an issue that was ultimately unresolved at that stage, because in October 2012, the Scottish and UK governments reached an agreement whereby the UK government agreed to temporarily amend the Scotland Act to make it clear that an independence referendum was not included in the reservation of the Union. So a referendum was able to go ahead, legislated for by the Scottish Parliament. It was only an advisory referendum, so no legal result was specified. Clearly, further UK legislation would have been required for Scotland actually to become independent if that had been the outcome, but that process was not legally regulated at all. It was simply the undertaking in the Edinburgh Agreement that the two governments would respect the result and work together. So to reiterate, that doesn't create a legal precedent, but it is politically important in two ways, I think. Firstly, it creates an expectation that Scotland can at some point become independent, and that the UK institutions will not, or at least should not, stand in the way if there's a majority for independence. Secondly, it creates an expectation that a referendum is required for constitutional legitimacy. And again, this should be an agreed process. Next slide, please. So, since the Brexit referendum, the Scottish Government has made 2 formal requests for the UK Government to cooperate to allow it once again to hold a lawful referendum. The basis for that claim is really threefold. So Scotland has a right to self-determination, first of all. Brexit was a material change in circumstances, so that justifies reopening the 2014 result. And thirdly, that once again, the Scottish Government has a mandate to hold a referendum because there is a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. So far, though, unlike in 2011, the UK Government has refused to cooperate. It hasn't really explicitly contested the first 2 steps in the claim, certainly not the first one, but it has not this time accepted that there is a mandate to hold a referendum. In 2017, when the request was first made, Theresa May simply said, now is not the time for another referendum on independence because we need to complete the Brexit process. In 2019, Boris Johnson gave a different answer. This time he said, the 2014 referendum was a once-in-a-generation event. What is a generation? Well, pluck a figure out of the air, but he did suggest it might be as long as 40 years. So the UK Government not explicitly denying the possibility of another referendum, but very strongly asserting that it's for the UK institutions to control the timing. Next slide, please. Now, despite these refusals, Scottish Government hasn't given up. It's continuing to prepare for a second referendum. The Scottish Parliament has enacted general framework legislation. That requires another bill to apply it to a particular referendum question. A draft independence referendum bill was published just before the last Holyrood election in May last year. And since that election, ministers have repeatedly promised that they are going to introduce a bill into the Scottish Parliament. So far, no bill has appeared. And where we are legally is effectively back in the position that we were before the Edinburgh Agreement. In other words, the Union is reserved, but the Scotland Act is silent on whether that reservation includes an independence referendum. There has been an attempt to get that question resolved by the courts, but the courts have said, no, it's premature in the absence of an actual bill. So, if a bill is introduced into and passed by the Scottish Parliament, absolutely certain to get back to court. The Scotland Act has very, very extensive provisions for challenges to the legal competence of bills, both pre-enactment and post-enactment, and basically post-enactment, anybody with an interest, any voter, could challenge it. But actually more important in practice is the fact that there are also pre-enactment checks on vires. So mechanisms which are supposed to stop ultra-vires legislation being introduced in the first place. And this is the requirement on the minister in charge of the bill to state that, in their view, the bill would be within competence. Now, the key bit is that under the Scottish Ministerial Code, which is non-binding but still important, that statement has to be signed off by the Scottish Government law officers. And I think it's a reasonable inference that the fact we haven't seen a bill so far is because there are internal concerns about the lawfulness of a bill. Okay, final slide, please. So to conclude, I think we can see the UK and Scottish governments as being engaged in a game of constitutional chicken. Each is refusing to back down in the hope that the other one will do. The UK government, the Scottish government knows ultimately it needs the agreement of the UK Parliament to become independent, but it is hoping that if it continues to act unilaterally, then that agreement will become politically unavoidable. For its part, I think the UK government is simply trying to delay in the hope that the issue will go away. It doesn't seem to have a particularly clear strategy to make it go away, but it hopes that it will. It is a game in which the UK government has the upper hand. A unilateral referendum is legally risky, not only in the sense that it may be struck down by the courts, but also because the UK government could simply change the Scotland Act, not to make it clear that a referendum is within competence, but to do the opposite, to make it clear that it is outside competence. And that is a real risk. Also, of course, political risks in terms of opposition. But I think that the Scottish Government, unlikely to abandon its claim for political reasons, and that policy of obstructionism from the UK Government, if that really makes it impossible for independent supporters to, to have any democratic route to their goal, that is also politically very, very tricky. So there is a legal problem here, but the resolution to that legal problem is political. And I think that's probably a good point at which to hand over to John Curtice. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Aileen has set up brilliantly the context of what I've got to say. I, in a sense, am going to ignore the important legal questions and ask the question about, well, the reason why the Scottish Government has pursued now on 2 occasions a request to hold a referendum, both of which requests were refused or at least not acknowledged, is to look, however, what's happened at the level of the general public. To what extent has Brexit not simply generated an argument between 2 elites, but to what extent has Brexit actually changed attitudes in Scotland towards the subject of independence, which of course is relevant to the prospects if any referendum were to be held in future. Now, the first thing we should just remind ourselves, Aileen mentioned Kieran Martin's high-minded version of why the UK government agreed to a referendum after the SNP success in 2011, viz. That they thought that the SNP had a mandate. I would suggest that the low-minded reason is that they'd read the opinion polls and were pretty clear that the SNP would lose such a referendum, and therefore, as a result, the issue of independence would indeed be killed off, at least for a generation. However, that's not the way in which the 2014 referendum worked out. Here is just a trace of all of the polls that were conducted during the 12 months through to September 2014 when the referendum was held. The red line is no, the blue line is yes. And you can see, although indeed at the end, Scotland voted by 55% to 45% to vote to remain inside the Union, that result was much narrower than would have been anticipated back in 2011. And indeed, the long-term impact of the 2014 referendum on support for independence can also be seen here, which is data from Scottish Societies, which isn't based on the yes-no question, it's based on a more detailed question. But essentially just follow the blue line, all the way through to and including the SNP success in 2011. Support for independence was bouncing around between 1/4 and 1/3. Indeed, if anything, it had been rather lower since the SNP minority administration first came to power in 2007. But then just follow the right-hand line as we get into the referendum campaign, we get to the other side of the referendum, and you can see the long-term impact of the 2014 referendum was to result in a marked increase in support for independence. And in a sense, the reason, therefore, why the SNP can think of Brexit as potentially as a result of that wanting to instigate another referendum, not least of the reasons, is that they're perfectly well aware that in the wake of the 2014 referendum, the level of consent in Scotland for remaining part of the Union was much weaker than it had been before the 2014 referendum. But I'd also note, if we take the polls that continue to be taken on how people would vote in a second referendum, between the independence referendum and the EU referendum of 2016, But basically, although most polls, as illustrated by the superiority of the green line over the blue line here, although most polls said that basically, yes, there's still a majority for no, essentially we were still looking at a pretty similar position to the September 2014 referendum, i.e. that 45% support for independence remained relatively solid in that interim period. And then, of course, along came the EU referendum. It's not just that Brexit was pursued without the legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament. Brexit was pursued in Scotland without the popular consent of the people, as illustrated by the evidence of the EU referendum. In the wake of that, it certainly was the expectation of the SNP that there would be an increase in support for independence, because from their perspective, the outcome of the EU referendum was probably the best possible example you could have probably have given them in order to support the argument they had long been making, which is that for so long as Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom, then Scotland's democratic wishes, quote unquote, were always at risk of being overturned by the less progressive views in the perspective of the SNP of voters south of the border. And this seemed to be a very, very clear example. However, although the SNP were, since about 1990, have been in favour of independence within the European Union, and that European Union membership had become an integral part of its vision of independence, if we actually look at how people voted in Scotland in the EU referendum and look separately at the views of those who voted yes and those who voted no, what we discover is that the two groups actually voted in much the same proportions, i.e. Yes voters and no voters were more or less equally likely to reject the proposition that the United Kingdom should leave the European Union. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise, because as I will show you in a moment in a later slide, actually, although before the 2014 referendum, politicians spent hours arguing about whether or not an independent Scotland could or could not be a continuing member of the European Union. The yes side said it could, the no side said, oh no, it can't. Actually, this debate politically was a complete and utter waste of time, because actually there wasn't any relationship between people's attitudes towards the European Union back in 2014 and whether or not they voted yes or no. And essentially what happened in 2016 was simply a replication of that. And indeed, in the immediate wake of the Brexit referendum, the opinion polls did not, contrary to the expectations of the SNP, show much in the way of movement. They were still tending to show, as they with the green line, well above the blue line, around 55% support for being inside the Union and 45% support for independence. However, very rapidly after the Brexit referendum, the underlying character of support for independence and its relationship with people's attitudes towards the European Union began to shift. And this became evident as early as opinion polls conducted by YouGov in the late summer and autumn of 2016. What I'm showing you here is how at that relatively early period after the Brexit referendum, how yes and no voters of 2014 were saying they would now vote in an independence referendum, but doing it separately according to how they had voted in the 2016 referendum. And first of all, let's look at the no voters on the right-hand side. What you will see amongst those people who had voted no in 2014 and who voted leave in 2016, 93% of them were saying, yep, absolutely, I would vote no again. But amongst those who had voted no and remain, that figure falls to 3/4. So actually the SNP were not entirely wrong. Amongst at least some people who had voted no and remain, it appeared that the result of the Brexit referendum was sufficiently discombobulating that they changed their minds on the question of independence. But now look at the left-hand side. Yes, 86% of people who had voted yes and Remain were still going to vote yes. But amongst those who'd voted yes and leave, around 1/3 of the yes voters, support for independence was now down to around 2/3. In other words, there were people out there who said, well, now the United Kingdom has got the sense to leave the European Union, then frankly, that's fine, because I really don't like European Union membership at all. So what was going on, therefore, was a cross-cutting movement. But it was a cross-cutting movement that was indeed changing the character of support for independence. And you can see this in this slide where I'm using I can't use Remain or Leave because it didn't exist back in 2013. And I have to use a different question on attitudes towards independence, because yes or no didn't exist to the same over this whole long period. But notice 2013, 2014, 2015, those who I can classify as Eurosceptics, who are essentially people who either wanted Britain to get out of the European Union or at least said the European Union should be a lot less powerful, they were no more and no less likely to support independence than were Europhiles. But immediately we get to 2016, which is a post-referendum survey, the gap begins to emerge between the two groups. And by the time we get to 2019, Europhiles are basically 50% more likely than Eurosceptics to be in favor of independence. It's not just, however, the character that changes. Those of you who followed British politics on television in 2019 will be aware that a whole media circus descended on College Green, which is a piece of common land opposite the Houses of Parliament. And that media village was there to follow the repeated drama of Theresa May's increasingly failing attempts, followed by Boris Johnson's attempts, to get a Brexit deal through the House of Commons. Meanwhile, actually north of the border, the polls were now saying, well, actually, it's no longer 55-45. But as you can see, if you looked at the right-hand side, it's now got pretty close to 50-50. In fact, it was 51-49 for the Union. And why was this happening? It's essentially Brexit. What does it? Because as you can see here in this slide, which now breaks down, according to opinion polls, the whole track of support for independence separately amongst Remain and Leave voters. First of all, look at the far left-hand side, the summer of and autumn of 2018. 50% support amongst Remain voters for yes, 34% amongst Leave voters. So that's the sorting process having its effect. But then notice in 2019, support for independence has risen amongst Remain voters. It's actually gone down, if anything, amongst Leave voters. So that aggregate increase in support for independence that takes us to the 50-50 point in Scotland actually is very clearly the product of Brexit, and it's the product of rising support amongst Remain voters. Something which, if you go to the far right-hand side, is still with us. That gap is more or less the same as it was in 2019. Yes, there have been rises and falls in support for independence, and particularly during the course of the COVID pandemic, we had a whole consistent series of polls where there was majority support for independence. It's gone back now to basically 50-50, but that impact of Brexit on the level of support for independence is still with us. So the crucial thing you have to understand, therefore, is that in many respects, public support for Scotland's position in the Union is collateral damage of the pursuit of Brexit. It's changed the character of support for independence, but it's also resulted seemingly in a relatively long-term increase in the level of support for independence. That said, and just two much more brief observations. What isn't yet clear, even though it's very clear that people in Scotland think that Brexit is going to be economically very disadvantageous, it hasn't as yet tilted the balance of perceptions of the economic consequence of independence necessarily in favour of yes. This is one poll from YouGov which repeated back in January 2020 a question that they had asked repeatedly before September 2014. And as you can see, basically, it's still the case that slightly more people think that Scotland will be worse off as an independent country than think that it would be better off. So this is still not a battle that the yes side have won, despite Brexit. An opinion which did the same thing also still show a narrow group of people thinking that independence would be damaging. But do have to remember that in the end is going to be a judgment about the impact of independence against also the impact of Brexit. One other thing to note, and this in a sense is to some degree in contradistinction of the message that Katie was telling us about Northern Ireland and how the centre has grown in Northern Ireland. When the SNP got an overall majority back in 2011, they did so quite heavily on the back of people who did not support independence at that time. Around 2 in 5 of the people who at that time were in favour of devolution voted for the SNP. And they were voting for the SNP because they thought the SNP could provide Scotland with more effective government. And indeed, you have to remember, and again, this has come back to some of Aileen's remarks, the reason why the SNP ever proposed the idea of having a referendum as the pathway to independence was because they wanted to decouple the question of independence from the question of voting for the SNP, because they thought that was crucial for the SNP's prospects of being able to do well in Scottish Parliament elections. And in 2011, it was crucial. However, those days are over. Just look at how now attitudes towards the constitutional question are politically polarized, with virtually everybody who is now currently a yes supporter voting for the SNP last year, and virtually nobody who is a no supporter saying that they would vote, saying that they voted for the SNP. So Scotland is now polarised around the constitutional question, in a sense, to a greater extent than Northern Ireland is polarised between orange and green. But there's also a political implication of this. Insofar as the SNP no longer politically need to pursue independence via a referendum in order to be electorally successful, that does raise a point, and this has been a point that's been raised by the SNP's arch lawyer, Ms. Cherry, MP, which is that, well, actually, if indeed the pathway to independence via referendum is blocked by the UK government, then perhaps the SNP should go back to what was its position, which is that if we get a majority of the seats in either the Scottish Parliament or the Westminster Parliament, we will regard that as a mandate to negotiate for independence. And while the SNP getting a majority for the Scottish Parliament is still quite tough, and they didn't get it in 2021 on their own, at the moment, getting a majority of the seats for Westminster is kind of relatively easy for the SNP under the first past the post system. So one of the things, therefore, to realise, and I don't think we can assume that the SNP will continue to be wedded to the referendum path if the referendum path is blocked. Rather, they will go down the path of saying, we've got a majority of the seats, that's it, that's a mandate. And bear in mind also that the next UK Parliament could well produce a hung Parliament in which the SNP are the hinge party. So the UK government doesn't necessarily hold all the cards on this, because we can't assume that the SNP will stick to the referendum as the only pathway. So in other words, I agree, on the one hand, coming back to my main point, Brexit has changed the game. It's changed who supports independence. The EU is now a central issue in the debate and what the relationship with the EU should be. But also notice that Scotland is now much more polarised on this subject, and this potentially changes the political options that the SNP have for how independence might be pursued. Although at the moment, one has to say, Scotland is just absolutely divided down the middle on the question of whether or not it should be an independent country in the first place.
Professor Curtice, thank you very much indeed. Our remaining speaker for this panel is Reuben Duffy. With his permission, I'm going to, towards the end of his talk, just let him know if he's running out of time. So that's agreed between us. Reuben, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this kind invitation. It truly is an honour to be here, especially for someone as young as me and just starting out. So my presentation obviously is not using slides, but I'm going to talk to you today about devolution, foreign policy and the UK Constitution in Scotland. And it's related to several of the themes that the professors have mentioned beforehand. So very famously in 1967, there was a woman called Winnie Ewing who won the Hamilton by-election for the SNP and represented the SNP's breakthrough into the Scottish mainstream. And she said the very famous quote, "Stop the world, Scotland wants to get on." Now that was in reference to perhaps an independent Scotland joining the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia in the aftermath of decolonisation. But it's a quote that very well fits the Scottish Government's international footprint and Scotland as a contiguous autonomous unit within the United Kingdom's international unit. So Scotland, despite not being an independent nation, has a considerable foreign policy footprint. This is in part a legacy of its past history as an independent state, as the Kingdom of Scotland, and very timely, the Auld Alliance, which is still referred to today by French and Scottish politicians. And even as part of the British Empire, when in union with England, Scotland has acted autonomously and had a distinct brand of imperialism within that empire, and has a distinct colonial legacy in many parts of the world that continues to affect its foreign relations. This distinct international brand, if you will, has only been upgraded and reinforced by devolution, by giving Scotland these devolved institutions and a devolved leader with an elected legislator to back it. And in the beginning, in the 1990s and moving into the early 2000s, this was certainly cross-party. Actually, the Conservative government of John Major established the first distinct Scottish institution in Brussels to kind of act as a conduit through which Scottish businesses and think tanks and such would engage with Brussels institutions. The Labour Lib Dem governments that governed Holyrood for the first few years of devolution continued in this vein. Donald Dewar was the First Minister and also took several visits to Brussels, further highlighting this international footprint. Most famously in these governments came related to Scotland's legacy as a part of the British Empire, the Scotland-Malawi partnership, which was Scotland's own distinct international aid programme that dealt exclusively with Malawi and was actually the result of a workaround by First Minister Jack McConnell and his advisors to see if they could, instead of contributing to a UK programme, create a distinctive Scottish programme. In 2007, when the SNP came in, this just continued. It's been almost like a snowball. It has just continued to grow and grow and grow. The SNP and the SNP Green government now in office have taken multiple steps to expand and strengthen Scotland's international influence and reach. Very recently, they committed to opening 2 new government offices representing the Scottish Government abroad in Copenhagen and Warsaw, in addition to an already considerable network of around 10, further upgrading Scotland's international profile. The COP26 conference in Glasgow only further illustrates this. Nicola Sturgeon held the symbolic rank of host. She was pictured alongside several international leaders, Joe Biden, and other such powerful people, and it's the symbol of a Scottish leader acting independently on the world that's important. In terms of, I mentioned it was cross-partisan. This, however, as Professor Curtice mentioned with regards to the Constitution, as polarisation has come in, this has had an effect on how the parties have seen this international role. As you would expect, the pro-independence parties are the most in favour of this distinct role, obviously because they want Scotland to have a distinct foreign affairs and indeed an independent foreign affairs. And their manifestos reflect this, with the SNP and the Scottish Green Party both having extensive sections on foreign relations and developed foreign policies within that manifesto. Moving slightly along in the continuum, we have the Labour and the Lib Dem parties, which might be termed to represent the devolutionist term in the unions, the unionist parties. Both are kind of in the awkward squad right now. As polarisation has creeped up, they have found it difficult to support what can be seen in some quarters of the unionist movement as aiding and abetting independence by stealth. They are certainly supportive of programmes such as the Scotland-Malawi partnership and do engage with the Scottish Government and criticise and support their own international policies on a case-by-case basis, but they certainly do not put them forefront. Indeed, I think very telling in the Labour manifesto for Holyrood, the section on foreign relations was much smaller than the SNP, but crucially contained the line that foreign policy was reserved to the United Kingdom under the 1998 Scotland Act, reaffirming that they believed foreign policy was a Westminster competence. And lastly, we have the Scottish Conservatives, which, as the most traditionally militantly unionist party, are very rhetorically opposed to any suggestion that Scotland engages in the world in an autonomous matter, and indeed has a foreign policy at all, to the extent that some MSPs have written to the UK government arguing that it should intervene and stop what it sees as a secret plan to achieve independence. But that rhetoric notwithstanding, in their manifestos, they have still supported a separate Scottish trade strategy, which engages with the Scottish diaspora. So while rhetorically they are very against, militantly so I might add, they are still accepting, almost begrudgingly, of the status quo. And you may ask, why should I care about this? Why is it important? Well, as polarisation has increased in Scotland, so too has polarisation between the Scottish and UK governments. As my fellow panellists have pointed out, the relationship between the UK and Scottish governments is not always good in the present day. In fact, it's getting worse and worse by the year, it seems to be. The reasons for being are ideological, personality. One such instance of this is a former advisor, I believe, to the Johnson government revealed that when she suggested Nicola Sturgeon be included formally in COP26 by being given some kind of formal role by the UK government, she was laughed out of the room, metaphorically, so to speak, by Johnson. The UK government has shown signs of being threatened by Scotland's role, and certainly some of the Scottish government have sought to use Scotland's international profile to raise the independence movement. So as ever, the constitution is there. But also, what is also a problem is Scotland formally doesn't have any power over foreign policy, despite this significant footprint, if you will. The Scotland Act of 1998 reserves it to the United Kingdom, and that puts it in a bit of an awkward position as compared to other sub-state entities such as the Belgian provinces, Bavaria in Germany, Catalonia in Spain, and other such instances. So there's a degree of ambiguity there, because the UK government, for all it is opposed to facilitating this, it hasn't taken any steps as of yet to squash this nascent foreign policy, as it were. So what are the potential models to resolve this? Is there a way to do it, or is it fine to leave it? In my studies with the Constitution Society, I looked at several multi-state unions, Canada, Germany, Spain, Belgium, and the Faroe Islands. These all federations, to a degree, or union states, if you will, all allow their provinces a degree of autonomy in dealing with foreign relations, and in many cases actually have a coded set of frameworks that lay out exactly what they're empowered to do. In Spain, Belgium, and Denmark, the overall case is that typically where foreign policy is devolved, it is devolved in respect to all matters that are devolved to the contiguous unit. So, for example, the Catalan Statute of Autonomy of 2006 devolves justice, health, and other such policy areas to the Catalan government. And as part of that Statute of Autonomy, the Catalan government are empowered to conduct foreign policy on behalf of those policy areas, representing a significant formal institutionalization of an autonomous foreign policy footprint. Excuse me. In addition to that, several such as Germany actually mandate consultation and cooperation in as is the case in Belgium as well. In fact, there is a condition in the Belgian constitution that requires the sub-state foreign policies not to contradict the coherence of the overall Belgian foreign policies. Again, embodying that spirit of cooperation and consultation, something that has been sorely lacking, as illustrated by the Brexit process, in the United Kingdom's conduct with the Scottish Government with relation to foreign policy. Now, there are several hypotheticals for how this can be achieved, for how this situation can be resolved, but what is clear is that there is a very, very clear, significant drive in Scottish policy sectors, the Scottish civic society, to enact its own distinct foreign policy upon the world. That is not going away anytime soon. The situation, while ambiguous, is not pressing, but it certainly should be solved at some point. It would be better, and it would be better if it was done in a fashion that recognised Scotland's autonomy in this area, but also mandating consultation and cooperation between the UK governments and the Scottish governments. And there are several hypothetical scenarios through which this can be achieved. Professor Curtice mentioned the possibility of a hung parliament in which the SNP hold the power. NDREF 2 will obviously be at the top of their priorities, but they may also demand several powers related to foreign policy devolved to it, such as immigration, which, although not a foreign policy area, certainly heightens their foreign policy if they adopt a separate immigration policy from the United Kingdom, perhaps allowing them a closer relationship with the European Union, which they would certainly like. No UK party has seriously suggested reforming this situation. The Conservatives are quite happy as it is, and I suspect many of them would prefer it if this foreign policy footprint of Scotland went away. As to the Labour Party, there is a Gordon Brown is currently running a commission on the Constitution, and what that will recommend is as of yet unclear. But whether it will recommend the development of foreign policy, I leave that up to Gordon Brown. But I imagine the SNP and indeed other parties in the independence movement will have a lot to hash out. So thank you very much for your time.